Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I'd like to talk about collecting and understanding how to collect recordings. I started collecting records in 1969, and I got my first record in 1969, and I was somewhat hooked and fascinated by it all. And the interesting thing was, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know what an old record really was. I had no one to really talk to. And so it was kind of like learn as you go. And of course, I made a lot of mistakes along the way, and things I regretted, and things I didn't understand, and how I was taken advantage of by other people. That happens. It's part of the game, as it were. Well, I got my first record in school in 1969. And so I decided, being a serious collector, of course, that I would go around and try to find stuff. And I went to church sales and auctions and garage sales, and I'd find a 78 here or there. And then I found a magnificent collection of Kate Smith recordings, and I thought, wow, these are really ancient. They weren't that old, but who knew? And then um, there was a family who lived across the street from us. They were very old. And I don't know if they had any children, but those children hadn't lived there a long time. And they were a very, very dapper couple. He was always in a bow tie, and she was always in a lovely dress. And they were both probably about 80 at the time. And this was like 1971. And they had a garage sale. And it was filled with all kinds of fun stuff. And they had something called a focal radio. It was called a cathedral radio. I didn't know what it was exactly. And so they wanted $10 for it, and I had saved up, and I bought it for $10. And around that time, they had some records, and I found a Mario Lanza recording singing from the movie The Great Caruso. And I was going, who the hell's the Great Caruso? And so I had to learn and figure out who Caruso was. And then once I found out who he was, after looking it up in a encyclopedia, because that was the only thing you had then, I tried to figure out how to find recordings. And I found an LP in the school I was at and listened to that. And there was a fellow I knew. His name was Brockway. His last name was Brockway. He was an artist. And he had a son whose name was Sean, who was suffering from muscular dystrophy. And I used to take care of his kid, take him around, and his name. And so we would sit down, and I'd take him for walks here and there. And also at the same time, Mr. Brockway was selling stuff, and he had all kinds of neat things. He had goggles from World War One and other things like that. And I grabbed a lot of that stuff that I could afford, and I couldn't afford much. And he told me he found a Victrola. Now, let me explain so you don't laugh at me too much. I didn't know what a Victrola was. And I had seen an Edison phonograph play. And that was at the Edison Laboratory when I went there in 1964. But I had never heard of a Victrola. Or maybe I had heard the term by somebody in my family or whatever. And he said, in this Victrola was a Caruso record. Well, I was pretty excited about this because I had seen that record by Mario Lanza from a movie called The Great Caruso. So he must have been something fantastic. And so I went and talked to a great authority on things. I talked to my mother. And I said, did you ever hear of Caruso? And she said, oh, yeah, Caruso. His records are very valuable. They're very rare. I said, really? So I went back and talked to Mr. Brockway and said, I'll tell you what, being pretty savvy as far as I was concerned. I'll trade you my crappy cathedral radio for a Caruso record. Well, he must have looked at me like manna from heaven, and he said, sure. And so he took the cathedral radio, and I got the Caruso record. It was Garibaldi's hymn. I thought I could basically retire at this point. I was so clever. I got a Caruso record, and all I had to trade away was a Philco cathedral radio. And then I brought it home, showed my mother. Oh, everybody was so excited. And then I listened to it. And then I studied. And then later that year, somebody I knew, who knew I had a Caruso record, said, huh, you like Caruso records? My aunt has some. I was thinking, oh my God, how expensive. And she said, she'll give them to you. And I got 4 Caruso records for nothing. And I said, how could people do something like this? These things are priceless. And then I slowly started to learn and understand by 1972 that Caruso made a lot of records, and he was the biggest seller of records, and that his records are very common. And if you were that stupid to trade off a Philco cathedral radio, you deserved it. And so I learned. But you know something? Back then, who did you talk to? I didn't know. I didn't know anything. And I had an interest in early recording because of the Edison stuff, but I just didn't know. And so I've always been very, very willing to trade 5 Caruso recordings for a Philco cathedral radio. No one's taken me up on my offer yet. And nobody ever will. Just part of the growth of a collector. And now I do have some Carusos. I give them away to people. You know, especially young collectors. I try to give them piles of records and stuff. But there was a time when I thought I could retire by owning Garibaldi's hymn. But of course we learn, we expand. And now, near 50 years later, I don't bother looking for Caruso recordings unless they're blue zonophones, which is his rarest records of all. But I look to other artists, other recordings, which are far more rare, far more unusual, and so very different. So all of you young collectors, if you happen to be seeing this, we all go through that stage. But you're lucky you have the internet, and you have lots of people who have written fascinating books and lots of great information. And it's a very different world than it was in 1971. And that's my story on starting to collect records. That records are sometimes valuable. But if everybody knows about the singer, it's probably not the rarest of records. And if you get a cathedral radio,